Hey guys, it's Frederik of the FWX podcast. I want to continue talking about magic in projects like movies, TV series, animated works, and also adaptations and literacy. And I'm gonna do that in a moment, but before I start, you can like this video and subscribe to the channel if you want to. That helps us become more available, to helps the podcast and the channel to become more available to those people who like this kind of content. And I hope that you do that. You can also share this with friends and family or your work colleagues or just people here online as well. And you can comment in the comment section below. And I would love for you to do that as well. And one more thing before I start, I'm not a natural English speaker, so if I get something wrong or I mispronounce something, that is completely human. So that is all for you to know about this video and the little thing I start at every beginning of the video. Okay, so I'm going to talk about magic here, specifically communities. Like, if it comes from somewhere, there has to be a way to learn it. For instance, I talked about hard magic systems in the first video. You can find that video by clicking the card, by the way. And in soft magic 2, it will just be brought up in a learning pattern in an education form in a different way. I actually, now that I think about it, there's another example about that. And I'll talk about that in a moment too. In fact, let's just start from there. But first, I'm going to get a little smaller so you guys can get it. Of course, but so I'm sending pictures. So for a moment, I'm going to bring up this movie, The Sorcerer's Apprentice. So I saw this one years ago. I'm going to admit that I don't remember all that much about it. It is kind of a forgettable movie. But what's interesting here is that, as far as I can remember, it's not really explained all that obviously what it is about. The title implies, of course, what it is about. And this is a movie, by the way, with Nicolas Cage and Jay Baruchel. You might know him from the How to Train Your Dragon movie, the animation version. So this is a movie from 2010, has some interesting. So this movie, it has a prologue. Rather, the info on the page on Wikipedia implies that, because it says here in 740 AD in England, Merlin had three apprentices: Balthasar Blake, Veronica Gorloisen, and Maxim Horvath. So this has its origins in uh, magic in its ancientness, because if the figure of Merlin, the wizard or the magician, is often used with this kind of concept, this genre as well. And the other way, it actually ties into another video I did. I've talked about the Kingsman movies in my Get Wacky video, which you can find by clicking the card, by the way. One of the figures there, or I'm gonna get a little brother, those main agents, they get certain names, and Merlin is also one of them. So I wanted to mention that for a moment because I just thought of it. And so Merlin is an obvious name to talk about when it comes to magicians and wizards and all of that, because the myth of King Arthur and the folklore around him and the other stories from Great Britain is a big influence on people that write magic and use it into their fantasy projects as well. That also includes the other known sorcerers from that time, supposedly Morgana Le Fay, as I highlight her right here. Here's a picture of her as well. So those are two very known figures when it comes to magic. In fact, now that I think about it, the story of King Arthur itself does also include some magic. The initial story, because there have been many adaptations, many stories, many uh, projects about King Arthur, because then that is about the hero's journey, which I might talk about in a future video, or heck, I might get into that in a moment as well because of the next person I want to talk about. So I wanted to point it, I inadvertently started to talk about where some of the origins from magic are from and whether they're uh, set up in a hard magic system or a soft magic system, which is interesting because that is also what you need to think if you are a aspiring writer wanting to be an author. You can study the greats. That includes the stories from English folklore, like the King Arthur story, for instance, which there are many, of course, about the origins of King Arthur, about his knights, about his fights with Morgana Le Fay, and with his son, Mordred. I needed to think about that name for a moment. So there's a lot of origins when it comes to where you write your magic system from, and how you imply that is up to you. Okay. So I wanted to talk about the fact that magic oftentimes needs to be learned. And I'm going to do that by starting to talk about right now one of the biggest franchises that there is. So I've talked a lot about Marvel and superhero genre, of course, and they and DC also have a lot of magical influence. And Marvel has done that interestingly with Doctor Strange and its sequel. That includes the second movie as well, which I'm highlighting right here, Multiverse of Madness, which is one of my personal favorites from the latest branch of movies that we have had from Marvel, because there's a lot of Lord of the Rings thematics in there. And but originally, the story of Doctor Strange is an interesting one because it implies both the hero's journey that I just talked about for a moment, with the Joseph Campbell hero sorry, I'm gonna try that again. I talked about that a moment ago with the hero's journey, the Joseph Campbell thing of the man with a thousand faces. I'm butchering that line, of course, but it's something like that where we have this straightforward kind of line of people. Think of it. Think of it for a moment as a video game, like a single player story game, where you have a character that needs to get to a point and reach a goal. But in the process, you need a bunch of things. You need an outfit, you need gear, you need to know what you are doing, and all of that happens in the story of Doctor Strange as well. So initially, Doctor Strange in his story in Marvel in the MCU is of a man with a good amount of power over life. He's literally a doctor, a, a top surgeon. Yeah, I thought I was gonna mispronounce it, but no. And he has an accident where he loses control over his hands, and they twitch a lot. And he is so much at the top of his game that he has enough money to do very experimental medicine to try and get his hands to control his hands. And he gets a lot of advice from both the people that he knows in the medical fields and then his, I think it was his fiance at the time. And so it starts to kind of spiral at the same time, too. You see this uh, kind of all knowing figure, powerful, kind of a jerk as well, who thinks he knows everything, start to spiral towards an end where he hits rock bottom finally. And then he is told of a different way to do things. And he starts to look out for another way to deal with the pain that he is dealing with. Because I imagine if you have no control and have constantly twitching fingers and hands, you are in a lot of pain if you're not taking as experimental in medicine as he is in the first movie. Or that is at least very much implied that that happens. And so Doctor Strange ultimately goes to a place called Kamartash, which is, I'm going to give you a picture of that as well. So Kamartash is a place the in Nepal, in that region, right between uh, Nepal and China and then Bangladesh. So somewhere in those mountains, there is a place called Kamartash, which is basically a kind of school in Eastern influence and very much influences from the Asian countries where there are wizards or sorcerers training to become an even more powerful, more well known, and learn about how to use magic. But as I've said in my previous video, they call it the mystical arts. And it's a clever thing actually to do because that differentiates magic in this universe in the MCU different from any other because oftentimes that is not used, that term. In fact, here's, I'm gonna check on something for a moment. I'm gonna play a clip actually, just for a moment here on YouTube. Ah, it wasn't an ambience thing, but it was a. So there's this picture here studying the mystic arts in Kamartash with Dr. Strange and Wong. So there's a library in Kamartash. So that means that this is basically a hybrid kind of magic system where we as the viewer do not know what they are doing. They know what they are doing because they are taught what to do. We also see that training montage, like in this picture, for instance. And also, now that I think about it, and I'll get back to me for a moment because I'm about to make this a little personal. And so, one of the things that happens in this movie is that Doctor Strange ends up with a disability because of the accident with his twitching hands and with the uh, feeling of no control. And as a person with a disability himself, that is very much felt for me. And but you can also incorporate that in your story as well. And that's also part of the community thing that I wanted to talk about here is that oftentimes the people using the magic have to use it because they're defending themselves from other threats, which would include uh, monsters, creatures, other sorcerers, which I'm going to get back to Doctor Strange here. So, one of the things that happens in this movie, spoiler alert if you haven't seen both Doctor Strange movies, is that by the end of the first movie, his buddy that teaches him how to use the magic, um, Mordo, Carl Mordo, played by Chiwetel Ejiofor in that movie. I'm gonna find you. Wait. Uh, so the black actor here above me, right here, that's Chiwetel Ejiofor. So that's him. That's Carl Mordo. So in this movie of Doctor Strange, we see what happens. I'm not gonna completely spoil it, but eventually at the very end, Mordo has become so disillusioned with everything that he just straight up leaves, which opens up an interesting comeback for Chiwetel's role as Carl Mordo to potentially come back in the third Doctor Strange movie when that happens. In fact, I also want to mention here that there's been rumors that we might get a Strange Academy TV series, or however that project is gonna form itself, which is something from the comics initially, where we get a bunch of characters that are interesting to this side of the MCU together, which would include one of my favorite characters from these movies, from the second movie, after all. Just a second. I'm just gonna look up her name to be easy. There. So, America Chavez, the female lead in this second movie, played by Sochi Gomez, is more of a sci-fi character than a magic character, but has all the implications of becoming a sorcerer herself, sorceress in her case. Although when it comes to Marvel, it's kind of up in the air if she is man, woman, or something else because of the story of her in the comics, where she is, where she appears to be something in between, despite having the looks of a girl. But actually, this became one of my favorite characters since Endgame, and I hope to see her soon in a new project. Hopefully, that is Doctor Strange 3, by the way. So, she most likely is going to appear in that Strange Academy project if it turns out it's gonna happen. And she's also another thing I'm gonna mention in a future video, but I'm gonna say this right here as well. She's kind of an interdimensional hopper because she has the ability to hop from one universe or dimension, more of a dimension than a universe, because a universe implies a whole different system of planets and worlds and all of that, and a dimension implies more like dimensional travel, which happens a lot in that movie, of course. And so she, in fact, is a very interesting character, I think. and I would love to see her again because she has the ability. Uh, it's said here, right here, to portal, which is a very cool way of traveling in between dimensions. In her case, okay. Uh, let's go to another example when it comes to communities. So, but to recapitulate for a moment, so Marvel uses the Camartage Academy for sorcerers and wizards and all of that. But obviously, there are other examples. And while I have talked ad nauseum about Harry Potter because they have a hard magic system, the number one thing about this story is also that you get to learn magic in a community. In fact, while I would not agree with everything that happens, here's a hot take for you guys, by the way. I think this story needs a complete rewrite. Uh, I have mentioned in a different video where I did a pitch for a prequel for Dumbledore, like before the Fantastic Beasts things, because of an idea that I saw online on YouTube with the Super Carlin brothers. Huge shout out to them, by the way. That there's a potential idea for a prequel for Dumbledore before all the Fantastic Beasts thing. Because so Jonathan, the glass, the glasses guy from the Supercons channel, uh, they, I'm gonna say this in a different way. So they have the idea that maybe Dumbledore was a Triwizard champion all the way back in the end of the 19th century, likely in 1894, and then most likely he was there as a younger wizard, kind of like Harry. And I said this in that video as well that Dumbledore parallels Harry in a lot of ways. But actually, this all leads into what I want to say here as well is that when it comes to learning magic in communities, you want that to be as safe as possible. And when you're in those years, think of the prequel that I just talked about for Dumbledore for a moment. That would have been a more safer time to learn magic. That's also another thing. Like time and place is a huge thing for making magic into your project. Whether you're writing it, whether you're making a script, whether you're making a book, time and place is a huge thing. In fact, I've talked about that as well in a different kind of context, and that is all about settings. Full video by clicking the card, by the way. And it's a very interesting way to put magic in a way that is not hasn't been shown yet because well, I don't know how many people think about this because when it comes to the Harry Potter franchise, for example, is that when we're talking about this franchise, we often talk about just the movies, but obviously those are adapted from the books, which were written before and during, because they weren't finished by the end. But anyway, but those stories take place in the 1990s. In fact, around the time that I was supposedly born, but then in a fictional setting, which is that thing exactly. Like, where do you set it in your story, and where does it apply? Also, a huge thing here with them is numerology and how much the numbers mean to the characters. For instance, the magical number has always been number 7, and I would also interpret 13 as a magical number, by the way, but that might just be me because I was born on the 13th, and I've always loved that number. And which is another community kind of thing that you think about when you're writing magic in a story, is that what age are you when you find out that you are magically gifted? And it could be like the age where you start going to school, whether it's to put it in American terms, elementary school or high school, or when you're just about to become an adult. Like the ages can vary, and that could also depend on the community that you're in. I mean, look at Harry, for instance. He, in his community, well, think about it. He's a half blood, according to the context from the books and the movies, but he has to live with the family that he didn't really like or care or love about, but they were family. So, despite the situation that he was in, he was going to be safe, supposedly. But then you go into the whole ward system and the trace and all of that, which leads into what I just said about numbers and age. And so that's a whole big thing where can think about at what point do they get the magic? Are they magically gifted at birth, or does it happen some way across the evolution of the character? And that can also lead into the community, like in the Harry Potter franchise, where you get to see students going to school learning about the magic, which, like I said before in the previous video, is pretty much a hard magic system because you literally get to see them as our, let's call it an avatar for a moment, as our avatar in film, learning about all the magic and the lore and the context and all of that. So that's a huge thing as well. In fact, just because I said Avatar, let's talk about Avatar, The Last Airbender, for a moment. Because in many instances, that is also the case here. Your community is a huge thing when it comes to the magic in this franchise. Of course, like I've said before in that previous video, there's different kind of magic systems. I said soft and hard, especially, but there's other versions of it too, like hybrid and also elemental magic, which is pretty much what this franchise has. It, although I would say it's kind of a mix. Like they know what they're doing, and they are learning it. By the way, you see Katara literally. I'm gonna get the pictures, because then I can point to stuff. So Katara, the waterbender girl, doesn't initially know exactly what she is doing, but she knows that she has a gift, and she wants to learn it herself. But because of where she lives and the time and her age and all of that, she hasn't really the moment to do it. It's just on very alone, isolating moments that she can do those things. In fact, that's how it all starts with her accidentally freeing Aang using her water bending, which sets off the whole story, of course. And that also kind of leads into what I want to mention. What I'm saying here is that the story of Aang is of someone who is already pretty well knowing about their own culture and their community, living in uh, also isolated but elevated parts because the monks The spiritual people that use airbending live in remote places and they learn about their magic system, their air bending from their masters, and eventually end up with tattoos, which is a dead giveaway for if they are a gifted bender or not. Which is the case with Aang, for instance, who at 12 years old became a master airbender, basically. And there's some more examples of learning magic in community. I'm gonna go over a few of them briefly. So, yeah, open up the images here for a second. So, The Witcher also does this. I know there's a lot of controversy and stuff with The Witcher, but I wanted to mention here because this is in such a kind of different context and story and themes that there are different ways of doing this. Like, um, how you learn magic and where it is and all of that really matters to what you're making with your story. And that can also take very dark themes, like it is mentioned and seen in The Witcher in both the games and the video, um, in both the games, the TV series, and the initial literature as well. Because The Witcher is also a series of adaptations coming from I think I have it right with Andrei Sapkowski. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that name. And well, to give you a bit lore, The Witcher is about a man called Geralt of Rivia, played in the TV series more recently by Liam Hemsworth, and before that by Henry Cavill, who's a massive nerd, but also a very attractive man. And but interestingly, that's also kind of who Geralt of Rivia is. Someone with their own story, with darkened material, with creatures that he hunts. Because a witcher is literally someone who uses magic to kill monsters. And they also use weapons as well. That's another thing here about the community thing is that with things like Harry Potter, you use wands, as that card here implies. I'm gonna click on it for a moment so you can buy that stuff also. I'm not that huge into merchandise, but it's a thing in world, of course, that matters because it's one of those first things that Harry encounters when he enters the wizarding world for a moment because they need a wand and because it's also a huge deal in the story initially. Kind of the same thing with the Doctor Strange universe. Head back to the pictures with him. Like, he initially doesn't really use a weapon. He uses a more martial arts kind of way of magic. That's another huge thing, of course, when you're writing magic in a story. But what are you using for it? Your limbs, your hands, your fingers, or maybe you're using an object, maybe a staff, or a wand, or something else. You can come up with an original thing yourself, which also makes things incredibly interesting. In fact, here's in this picture right here, or in the other pictures from the comics initially, you see him wielding a staff, or he reads it from a book or something, which in some other uh, pop culture franchises is also done. Again, that depends on what your intentions are for the magic in your story. I want to mention another recent example, and this is one that I know not a lot about, but it's from a couple of years ago. It's called The School for Good and Evil. It's basically a very separated Hogwarts kind of way where people are separated by how they are like. Because I'm gonna head back to Harry Potter for a moment, not the wands, but that depending on who you are separated towards the people that you are closest with, which also leads back into the community thing. Is that who are you close with? The people that you initially go to, or maybe those that have more ambition, that have more intelligence, or maybe more hearthy and warm and want to eat and that kind of stuff, but also the capability to manipulate. And I just summed up the couple of houses that there are in Hogwarts in a different way, because manipulation and uh, an inability of culpability kind of leads to you being in a Slytherin house, for instance, or where you're more hearthy and you love to eat and that kind of stuff. You might be a Hufflepuff, or maybe you are more for integrity and intelligence, and being a perfectionist might make you a Ravenclaw, or maybe you're brave, you are a fast learner, you are courageous and all of that, you might be a Gryffindor. So it all leads into the community aspect of magic here, where you are intending to send your characters towards. I've talked in a previous video about the fact that you can have one protagonist or one in a different variant in its different variety, a man, a woman, a creature, or an animal or a pet or something like that. All depends on what you want in the context of your story, of course. But that's also something you can consider. Maybe it's a group, maybe it's all those things together, which also kind of leads to what you see in Harry Potter as well. You have the initial trio: Harry, Ron, Hermione, and then people they meet: Luna, uh, Cedric, uh, Professor Slughorn, who is a Slytherin. You have so many different people. It's kind of like in real life with finding your people, that you find your community and the people that you love and you care for, which is a huge thing when you're writing a story as well. And that is very much what you see in those projects and those examples with Harry Potter, with The Witcher, with Doctor Strange, and with this example as well. The thing with this example, the School for Good and Evil, is that unfortunately it did not do all that well. It will probably have its own fans, of course. And if you have an argument, you can do that in the comments, by the way. I have no problem with arguing, but do come at it in good faith, not bad faith, please. And then another interesting one I wanted to mention, that I've mentioned before in that previous video, is Shadow and Bone. And this is very much like a more survivor's guide in magic in terms of the story, because she also learns about it, Alina. You can see the pictures of her here. And also because she has a different magical set than I've mentioned before with the other examples. She isn't just the user of a larger magic system. She has specific magic abilities. Also something you can consider for yourself. What is the magical power set that they have? and that kind of ties everything together. It all depends on you, what you want in your story, and what you can do with it. And then also, I haven't said this yet, oftentimes magic has a cost. And that can be like, for instance, with Marvel, with Doctor Strange, I've explained that magic in this case is basically like otherworldly energy that they use. So that can have a cost on you. Or for instance, thinking here. Or you know what? I'll just talk about this for a moment myself. So in many different ways, magic can have its own cost. It could be from energy that you use from somewhere else, or your own energy. I've explained in that previous video about one of my own projects where you can harness your own energy and turn it into dragon fire coming from you, which is another way to deal with things. And one of the best tips that I can give you about all of that is that you keep it original. And that makes everything so interesting. And I know I use that word a lot, but I really dig when things are not stale, when they are evolving naturally, chronologically, and it can be interesting to see that happen. And obviously, I did not touch upon other examples. There are more that I did not talk about, or am ignorant even about. Like, there's a whole bunch of things from books, from fantasy authors that they use. I think of the things that Brandon Sanderson does, or um, there's another one that I think about, kind of close to something from Shannon and Bone, where they use gunpowder as a magic form. And that reminds me of another author that I am forgetting. But anyway, so I hope you liked this kind of content from me. It's always interesting to talk about magic in projects because you can do so many things with it in all its variety. And so I'm gonna close this video off. So guys, thank you so much for listening and watching to this episode of the FWX podcast. Before I go, you can like this video. You can also subscribe to the channel. That helps us become more available, the channel and the podcast, which would be nice for people who are looking for this kind of thing, that kind of want a different kind of take from things. And that's actually something that I love doing with my channel and this podcast, is to give you some out of the box ideas as well. Because when you look at the masters, which you definitely should learn about, they will give you all those initial things that I just talked about too. Whether it's a Harry Potter or something from Marvel or superhero or from the original literacy and literature things, like with Merlin and Doctors, uh, and with King Arthur and all of that. So thank you guys for being here. You can also share this with your friends and your family or your colleagues at your work or just here online as well. I would love for there to be open communication in the comments here below where you can talk with each other or arguments, but please do that in a polite and friendly way as well. Okay, that is it for me. I've been Frederik for the FWX podcast, and I will see you guys in a future video. See ya.